So the thing is that although technically your grades are determined at the end of the first semester, this is actually not the true reality. And this is a subtle thing that you need to understand, because this is the important point that makes a big difference, is that your grades are actually determined effectively after the first month, or even less. And the reason is because of these little lines that I've drawn here on this timeline. So if this is the end of the first semester, then here and here represent your first tests. So your first test is actually, should be actually around there, just before the middle of the semester. So it's around 6 weeks into your university year. So your first test, which counts for around 30%, and it depends on the paper, but roughly it counts for a lot, of your semester core paper grade, you're getting assessed on that after the first 6 weeks. And this becomes a really big problem, and this is where most students will screw up. So I'd say around 80 to 90% of students that don't enter into medical school successfully in their first year make this mistake. This is the reason why, and it's downhill from this point onwards. And so the reason is because if you take, let's say, a week or maybe 2 weeks to get into the flow of university, get to terms with things, see how you're doing, figure out how to study more effectively, optimize yourself and all of that sort of stuff. That means that you've reached a sub A+ level for 2 weeks worth of learning. The difficulty of pre-med and the volume of information is such that it's not really possible to catch up too much. As a result, you will be behind on a couple weeks of material, and then because you're behind, you never really get a chance to catch up on it, which means that your first test ends up not being A+, which means that you now need to get above A+ level so that it compensates by the end of the semester. So an A+ boundary is given a mark of 90%. So you need to get 90% or above to get an A+. And from there, it goes down in 5% increments. So an A would be 85 to 90%. And then an A- would be 80 to 85%. And then so on and so forth. It keeps going down in 5% increments until 90%, which is the boundary for A+. So if you get 85% in your first round of tests, instead of getting 90%, you now need to get like 93 or 94% in your second test or exam. Your second test and your exam actually tend to be harder than your original ones. So as a result, if you screwed up on your first test, it becomes really hard to get A+ for all 3 core papers that are in that first semester, which is why so many students screw up. And you can generally tell, I've been doing this for a really long time. If I meet students after the first month and they're really struggling, 85% of the time, they won't be getting in. The other 20% of the time, they're really hustling. They're working really, really hard to overcome that. And most of the time, they're still not going to get triple A+ for the end of the year, for the end of that semester. Now, the next question is, do you really need triple A+ to get in from the first semester? Technically, no, but there's some important ramifications of that. Is that if you don't get 3 A+, because the only paper left in the second semester that's a core is Med-Sci, that means that you pretty much need to get A+ in Med-Sci. And Med-Sci is actually the hardest paper of the year. So if you don't do well in the first semester, you will find it even more difficult to do well in the second semester. And usually that break in the middle is not enough to suddenly, just develop these like godlike studying skills that you just lacked a few weeks before that. So really the year is determined after the first semester. And so even though there are around 1,500 to 2,000 students at the beginning of the year trying to enter into medical school, only about half of those students will be remaining kind of in the race competitive in the middle of the year. So by the middle of the year, half the students have already dropped out because they realize that their grades aren't enough and they're not going to be able to sustain it. So like I said, Auckland is intense short at the beginning, but if you just ride that part well, and there are definitely strategies that make it much, much easier than it would normally be, then you can actually have a reasonably cruisy rest of the year because you just need to worry about getting either an A or an A+ for MedSci. So let's look at the actual grades that we are looking at needing for our first year entry. This is actually pretty much the same between both Otago and Auckland, so it's directly relevant. So we mentioned that an A+ is 90% and above. This is actually given a number of 9.0. An A, which is 85% and above total weighting, is given 8.0. An A-, 80% to 85%, is given a 7.0. So for example, if you take 4 papers and your grades are A+, A+, and then A, then you've got 9 plus 9 plus 8 plus 8. Divide that by 4 and you get your grade point average, GPA. So your GPA in this case will be 8.5, right? If you get A+ and then 3 A's, your grade point average would be 8.25, right? So at what combination do we start running into risky territory? So remember that to be eligible, you need to be at either a B or a B+ above. And below that, you're not even eligible. You need to basically be at A+ to be competitive. So the safe GPA to enter into medical school, and when I say safe, I mean as long as you don't screw up your UCAT and the interview, you should be okay, is around 8.5. And there are lots of situations where 8.5 GPA will not get into medical school still. 8.75 is really where it's safe. And then 9.0 is, again, the safest. But even then, if you really screw up your UCAT and really screw up your interview, you can get overtaken by an 8.75 or another 9.0. So around 25 to 30% of the people entering into medical school actually have a GPA of 9.0. All A+. Around 75% of the students that enter into medical school will have at least an 8.5. Depending on the year, some students with an 8.25 might get in, but these days, looking at last 2-3 years, GPAs lower than an 8.5 tend not to get in, although there are exceptions. And they usually have to get an excellent interview and a pretty damn good UCAT. Okay, so to summarize what we've just sort of been talking about, we've got the first year health science, first year biomed, and then at Otago, first year health science. In Otago, we're looking at the best 7. In Auckland, we're looking at the 4 core papers. And across the board, we are needing to get basically an A+ level for all of those in order to be competitive. And this is why UCAT and interview are more important than what you might suspect from just looking at the percentage numbers. So when you look at the UCAT only being 15% importance at Auckland, you would actually miss the fact that of all the people that are applying for medical school, there's only really 3 combinations of GPA that are competitive for that. You have 8.5, you have 8.75, or 9.0, which means that you have hundreds of students that only have 3 different GPAs. The UCAT is measured out of thousands. The interview at Auckland is measured in hundreds. And you could get a score on any of those, which means that every individual person could have a very different score. And so grades at this current stage have become more of a gatekeeper. You have to reach a certain level of A+, and then you're sort of considered eligible in a way, like the real eligibility. And then after that, you're really determined by your UCAT and your interview. So it's not as small importance as a 15% or a 33% might give it. It's actually much more important. And in Otago, the UCAT is even more important because they don't have an interview. They use the 5th section of the UCAT, which is a situational judgment test, as in they give you situations and see how you're going to react. They use that instead of an interview. And you need to get a minimum mark across all 5 sections in order for you to be considered eligible. And that minimum threshold isn't really publicized, and we can't really make any extrapolation because they've only done it for 1 year so far, because UCAT was new last year. But if you don't get a certain level of the UCAT, you're not even considered. Your grades aren't even looked at. At Auckland, it's not like that. They just look at your scaled score. So even if you bombed out on the UCAT, you still have a chance as long as your grades are high enough and you get really good on the interview. The general accepted in New Zealand safe mark for UCAT is 90th percentile and above, based on what we can tell so far. 85th percentile and above, maybe. At Auckland, we might be even able to go down all the way down to like 50th percentile or even lower, as long as we get really, really good grades and an almost perfect interview, then we still might be competitive. But generally, if you're aiming for the UCAT score, we would be looking at trying to get the 85th or 90th percentile and above.